Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Wasserman at the 2018 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Jill Randolph. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce our presentation, The Secret to Outperformance, presented by the Boston Consulting Group Henderson Institute. Today's speaker is Peter Tolman, who is a senior partner and managing director at the Boston Consulting Group. And with that, I'll give it over to Mr. Tolman.
Great. Thanks very much, Jill. How many of you attended Barack Obama's talk yesterday? Most of you. Well, that's good, because it was, as I think you'll find out, it was a pretty good warm-up act for this. And my only question to the organizers is really why they gave him a bigger room than they gave me. But we'll figure that out soon enough. So to start off where he ended off, here are 8 teams from the NBA. Would anyone like to guess what they have in common?
Not winning.
Correct. They all had below average performance, but above average payroll. Compare them to these two teams, the winners of the Western and the Eastern Conference, respectively, the Boston Celtics and the Golden State Warriors. Both had below average payrolls, yet above average performance. They had something else in common as well, and that is assists. Golden State and Boston led the team in assists, 30 per game by Golden State, and 25.5 for the Celtics. And those 8 other teams, all but one were below average. Golden State was almost 30% higher in number of assists, and the Celtics were 15% higher. Now, an assist embodies a key concept in teamwork, an effective teamwork, and that concept is cooperation. You see, an assist involves a sacrifice, because while basketball is a team game, there are also individual stars. And nothing counts more to the fame and fortune of an individual star than the number of baskets shot. So when a player chooses to assist, to pass the ball to another player so that that other player can shoot, they're sacrificing their own interests for the greater interests of the team. Cooperation is about acting in ways that improve the effectiveness of others. So it's the essence of teamwork. Without cooperation, the whole is only equal to the sum of the parts. The only way you get the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, the only way you get a great team, the only way you get that kind of context that President Obama spoke about yesterday is through cooperation. But cooperation always involves a sacrifice. In the case of Golden State and the Boston Celtics, the sacrifice is assisting so that you lower your points total. Points total is 40% more than any other track metric correlated with pay. Perhaps even more remarkable is that some players, in the interest of cooperation, are willing to sacrifice pay in order to play with a winning team. Kevin Durant, for example, of Golden State, one of the superstars of the NBA, just last year re-signed with Golden State for a contract worth $10 million less than other teams were offering him. So cooperation, while very powerful, in any team environment, be it in business or be it in sports, is equally rare. And it's equally rare because it involves a sacrifice. So the question becomes, how do you foster cooperation? If it is so powerful, if it is the real secret to outperformance, how do you foster cooperation? And in order to explain that, I need to introduce you to a framework that we at the Boston Consulting Group called Smart Simplicity. And we've used that framework with teams around the world. We've used that framework with leading corporations and organizations around the world. Because when you ask people what is the key to cooperation, the most common answer you get, whether they're coaches, whether they're business leaders, the most common answer you get is cooperation comes from people who are selfless, people who have a set of qualities. And while that's a well-intended notion, nothing could be further from the truth. Cooperation emerges when there's an environment or a context that's set up for cooperation. You see, there's nothing about the genetic makeup of Golden State or Boston or the upbringings of the players involved that leads them naturally to want to cooperate more than players on other teams. It's because the team environment has been set up in such a way that cooperation is fostered or promoted. So smart simplicity consists of a couple of important principles. The first is the recognition that the performance of any organization, of a sports team, of a business organization, of any other kind of organization, is tantamount to behavior. Performance is what it is because people behave the way that they do. It's how they act. Behavior is how people act. It's how they interact with one another. And it's the decisions they make. And behaviors are rational. And by rational, I don't mean in an analytical kind of way, the kind of way that we're speaking about at this conference. By rational, I mean that people do things for a reason. We're intentional in the way that we act. And people typically make decisions to act in ways that they perceive to be in their own interests, to be winning strategies for themselves. Put it differently, people typically don't act in ways that they believe are going to be harmful to themselves. But if you buy these two propositions, then a natural corollary is the following, that if you want to improve performance, you have to make a different set of behaviors rational. Now, let me illustrate this by showing you a couple of photographs from my family album. This is my daughter, Jessica, who's played soccer throughout her life. She specialized in goalkeeping from fairly early on. This is her saving a goal in one of her college games. Of course, as many of you know, having a daughter who's a sports person or a soccer player means that you travel all over the region, all over the country to support and watch games. And being the parent of a soccer player is often not the most relaxing thing. You can see my wife, by the way, in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, and the reason is when it comes to soccer, by the way, because soccer which is the world's most popular sport, despite what you may think living here in the United States. But when it comes to soccer, it's a much more free-flowing game, typically, than the major American sports. But there is one set piece, which is the penalty kick. And here's a photograph of Jessica facing a penalty kick. And you can see that in this instance, she gets her body behind the ball. She gets right in front of it. She traps the ball and she deadens it, so there's no rebound. But that kind of success is not typical for a goalkeeper, because typically in the case of a penalty kick, the odds are on the side of the penalty kicker. Here's some of the facts. Stephen Levitt, the behavioral economist, has researched this topic and found that when it comes to a high level in soccer, about 75% of penalty kicks go in. The reason is the following, that it's only 12 yards from where the ball is placed to the mouth of the goal. The ball travels at 80 miles an hour or more, and so there's 300 milliseconds or less, which is too fast for anyone to react. So the goalkeeper has to decide ahead of time whether to dive to the left or the right. And it turns out that they dive to the right 57% of the time, and to the left 18% of the time. And the reason is that most kickers are right-footed, so they prefer kicking to the left. The interesting thing about those numbers, though, is that 57 plus 41 equals 98. So what happens the other 2% of the time? The goalkeeper stays in place, which should give a penalty kicker a good idea. Because if the penalty kicker were to kick right at the goalkeeper, perhaps they'd have a higher chance of getting the ball in. And indeed, that is the case. Kicks aimed at the center have a 7% higher chance of going in than kicks aimed at the side. 82% versus 75%, yet only 17% of kicks are aimed at the center. Now, obviously, if every goal kicker aimed at the center, it would make the goalkeeper's job a lot easier and the stats would go down for the penalty kickers. But all the analysis shows that teams would be better off if goal kickers kicked more to the center. So that's a mystery. Why is it? Why is it that penalty kickers are not acting in the interests of the team? Let's look at the payoff matrix. If you kick to the center, you have an 82% chance of glory. If you kick to the side, you only have a 75% chance of glory. The difference is in the payoff for failure. If you kick to the center and you miss, it's utterly humiliating. If you kick to the center, to the side, you still have good odds, and if you miss, it's disappointing. And by the way, the newspaper headlines and the commentaries tend to support that notion. So here's some World Cup commentaries, for example. When Netherlands' Wesley Sneijder kicked a penalty against Argentina and missed, or it was saved, I should say, the comment was, brilliantly saved. Or when Switzerland's Barnetta kicked a penalty and hit the crossbar, it was Barnetta hit the crossbar. Compare that to kickers who tried to go to the center, particularly the Swiss team against the Ukraine. Ricardo Cabanas, who is a famous midfielder, looked almost amateurish on his shot directly into the middle of the goal, and again, right at the Ukrainian goalkeeper. Or Marco Strella's effort for Switzerland was worse, low and directly at Shavkovsky, who's the Ukrainian goalkeeper. So it's not as though these numbers are a mystery in the game of soccer. But people always behave in their own individual interests. They follow individually winning strategies. And in this case, teams have not gotten penalty kickers to figure out how to cooperate because they're acting in a way that doesn't pay the sacrifice that cooperation requires to improve the effectiveness of others. So smart simplicity is really a lens to look at the performance of any team, of any organization. Performance is tantamount to behavior. Behavior is a rational response to the organizational context. And because an organization consists of a group of individuals, it is a system of rational strategies of the individuals in that organization or that team. Put differently, the behaviors you're getting are exactly the behaviors that the system is designed to produce. And if you want to get a different set of behaviors, if you want to get a set of behaviors that creates a different context, that increases cooperation, that gets your team to assist more than other teams, gets penalty kickers to kick towards the center more frequently so they increase their odds of goals, you have to change the system. So you get a different set of individual rational responses. The good news about this is that any team, any organization, by understanding this notion and understanding how to improve cooperation can significantly improve its performance. However, it's difficult. It's difficult precisely because cooperation requires a sacrifice. Now, we have a set of principles or a set of rules. We call them the 6 simple rules that are intended to promote cooperation. There's 6 of them, but they're divided into groups of 3. You can see 3 on the left-hand side and 3 on the right-hand side. The reason they're divided is that for someone to cooperate, they need to both want to cooperate and they need to have the ability to cooperate. They need to be empowered to be able to cooperate. So the 3 rules on the left-hand side are about empowerment. They're about giving people the ability to cooperate, whereas the 3 on the right-hand side are about getting people to want to cooperate. They're about impelling cooperation. Essentially, they're the carrots and the sticks. Now, to illustrate how these play out in practice, we've studied a number of sports teams that have achieved sustainable outperformance. It's very rare. It's very rare precisely because It's so hard to get cooperation on a sustained basis. But there are teams that have achieved it. And one very notable team is the US national women's team in the decade of the 1990s. Now, this team, throughout the decade of the 1990s, had an almost unbelievable record. Their record was 155 to 21 to 9, playing against the best teams in the world at the world's most popular sport. Compare that to the teams across all 4 major US sports last year, for example. The best record was Golden State with an 82% winning record, and that was only 1 year. This team achieved it for an entire decade and a 30% higher winning record. Not only that, but they didn't just beat their opponents, they absolutely crushed their opponents. The average win per game was 3 goals. So the question is, how did they do it? To understand their methods, we spent significant time with a panel of prominent individuals from that team, I should say. Coaches Anson Durant and Lauren Gregg, captains Carla Overbeck and Julie Foudy, star striker of the day, Michelle Akers, and one of the key defenders, Tiffany Roberts. What we discovered is that they employed the principles of the 6 simple rules in a way that put them significantly ahead of the competition. Perhaps most foundational was the purpose or the calling that this team set for themselves. Many of you, I'm sure, have either experienced or observed that in times of crisis, people rally, people come together. Whether it's an environmental disaster, a terrorist attack, or some other kind of crisis. The reason people come together is that that kind of a circumstance, a crisis circumstance, tends to naturally increase reciprocity and extend the shadow of the future. It increases reciprocity because it heightens the sense, people's sense, that their success depends on the actions of others. And it extends the shadow of future because the consequences of people's actions become more immediate and more real. Now, in the same way, a higher calling can do that for a team or any organization. And this team was not just playing to win games. This team was playing to achieve gender equality in sports. They were playing for women's equality through soccer. They were playing as much for my daughter Jessica as they were for their own record in the game of soccer. As Michelle told us, she said, when we played to grow the game. We did that intentionally. We wanted to expand what we felt was possible for women. They also played to dominate the game. Coach Dorrance, who spent much of his youth outside of the United States, felt slighted by what he saw as the lack of respect of other countries for the game of soccer in the United States. And he saw this team as an opportunity for payback. And he instilled that notion in the team from an early stage. And their strategy was simple. They were going to double team every single player on the opposing side. But that requires an extraordinary level of commitment to the team. So through increasing reciprocity, they were able to create a higher calling. They were able to withstand, as Michelle Akers did, over 30 orthopedic procedures in that period of time and come back and give all she could for the team. And when we asked her about it, we asked her, how did she let herself go through this? She said simply, that was my role. I was the target. And so I had to take the majority of the hits on the team. Now, there's something else about increasing reciprocity, which is if you have that kind of a purpose, that kind of a mission, that kind of a calling, it has to be embraced by all members of the team. And Coach Dorrance recognized from early on that it's relatively easy to engage the star players on the team. It's more difficult to engage those that are sitting on the bench most of the time. And so Coach Lauren Gregg spoke to us about engaging the 20th player. When, for example, Michelle would score a game-winning goal, which was not an unusual occurrence, they told us that they would give as much praise to the bench player who was assigned with keeping her hydrated as they would to Michelle. Now I'm sure that sounds crazy. It sounds almost unrealistic. But the way they described it, it was simply a consequence of the fact that in order for Michelle to score her goals, every team player had to play their role in order to put her in the best shape for winning. Perhaps the most striking example of this was illustrated by this photograph on the game. In the 1999 World Cup, the US was playing Germany in the quarterfinals, their arch rival. And early on in the game, defender Brandi Chastain, as some of you might remember, scored an own goal, which was devastating. It put the team in a hole. And that could have destroyed many a team. Yet it only caused the US national women's team to come together. Carla Overbeck, captain of the team, immediately went over to Brandi and told her that the team needed her now more than ever. They had begun a conversation on the bench among the coaches about benching Brandi at halftime and replacing her with another player. But Carla convinced them that that would not be a good idea. As the game turned out, the US won the game. Brandi scored one of the key goals in the game, and they went on to the finals of the '99 World Cup, which was the most watched, it still is, the most watched women's sporting event of any kind in history. And again, as some of you might recall, there was a game against China. Full time came, it was 0-0, it went to a penalty shootout. And no other than Brandi Chastain scored the goal-winning penalty to again give the US a World Cup. Now, there's something else about enhancing cooperation, which is that it's really important to understand what others on the team do. You have to understand what people do and why in order to be able to cooperate with them as effectively as possible and to be able to reward cooperation, to make it in people's interests. So they had a concept called walk in others' shoes, where before every game they would have an extensive team briefing where they went through the role of every single player and in public and talk about how that role contributed to the overall mission of the team. At practices, they would have players play in the positions of others on the team just so that they could experience it and know best, therefore, how to cooperate. That's the self-awareness that President Obama spoke about yesterday. Some teams took it even further, by the way. Another team that we've studied is Bayern Munich, which is the most successful German soccer club in history. And when we spoke to the longtime captain of that team, Philipp Lahm, who also captained the German national team, he said that even in games, when they were up and they were confident of winning, their coaches would switch their positions so that they could experience in a game setting what that might involve. Now, something else they did to understand what people did and increase reciprocity is create small societies. Small societies are subgroupings of the team that have to work together particularly effectively, say the attacking six or the defending four. And they would get objectives that required them to cooperate particularly closely together. For example, the defending four might have an objective of keeping key opposing players out of the penalty box during corner kicks. My personal favorite was a small society that they called the leaders of the bench. And amongst other things, their mission was to keep other players as hydrated as effectively as possible during game stoppages. The US national soccer team outperformed because they were able to apply these principles more effectively than any other team for the decade of the 1990s. Now, of course, they had great talent as well. You can't win games without talent. But when you speak to the players on this team or any other team or any organization that's winning sustainably, they will be absolutely adamant that it's not the differential individual talent levels that made the difference. It's the team dynamic and the way the team worked together. It's their ability to cooperate together. Michelle Akers' successor as striker on the team was a player by the name of Hamm, and she said it very effectively when she commented in the following way. She said, "I'm a member of a team and I rely on the team. I defer to it and sacrifice it because the team, not the individual, is the ultimate champion." Through application of the 6 simple rules, teams can indeed improve their performance. They can make sure that they are less like the high-paying, low-performing teams and more like these two. Thank you. Do we have no time for questions, apparently? Feel free, though, to be in touch. You can see my email address. And again, thank you very much for joining this session.